I'm Parveen Adams. We are here this evening to remember and cherish Marc. The main event is Bernard Tschumi, to whom I'm deeply grateful for having accepted the invitation to speak this evening. Ingrid Schroeder, the new director, will have the privilege of welcoming Bernard to the AA. I will be brief, and I request that you maintain silence at the end of what I want to say. I am here to thank the AA for its part in commemorating Marc through the naming of the hall and the preservation of the lectern, now with his signature inscribed on it. When Marc died, someone suggested that the lectern be cremated alongside him. It wasn't turned to ashes, but in a sense, without him, it did die. Then it was decided that this hall be named the Marc Cousins Lecture Hall. For Marc had his own way of thinking and delivering a lecture, and he transformed the hall into a space of performance rather than argument. In a sense, without him, the hall died. What does it mean that the hall now bears Marc's name? What took place with Marc at the lectern in this hall was what he called collective audition. In his final Friday lecture in 2018, titled The Lectern, he recalled the ecclesiastical history of the lectern, commenting that sacred space was often more democratic than secular space. Anyone could speak at the lectern when the Bible was the only text. There was no need for authorization. The lectern and the text united speaker and listener, producing a collective form of audition. To this I add, after that, a man could stand at a lectern and speak of anything whatever for as long as he liked, but with no guarantee of a collective form of audition. The lectern might thus suffer a loss of its function and might be sad. I'm a nobody, lonely and unloved. It takes a man with a singular style, a style of his own, to restore it to its role. It takes a man like that to thank the lectern, as Marc did in the last of his Friday lectures. With Marc, the lectern feels joy. I exist. I am loved. And so it is with the hall itself. The walls came alive with Marc's kaleidoscopic handling of culture, history, philosophy, of stories of his life experiences. The space was transformed into a theater. The wall said, I was sad and peripheral. Now I know what I am. If the Bible was the source of a collective form of audition, what can we say of the source today? I quote the American poet Charles Olson. That verse will only do in which the poet manages to register both the acquisitions of his ear and the pressures of his breath. The distinctive rhythm of a poetic line is not acquired through words, but through expressive punctuation, violating conventional syntax and grammar. If you have heard Marc speaking, you will know how well this description fits. Marc offered his lectures as poetry to capture and convey his nascent thoughts. The language of architecture is, of course, quite different. It is composed of concrete and glass, space and light. For Bernard Tschumi, there is another crucial element. He says, I would like people in general, and not only architects, to understand that architecture is not only what it looks like, but also what happens in it. And if movements and events change the structures that contain them, in turn, the structures affect those who inhabit them. Smells and sounds, the lived experience of buildings. My remarks on Marc, the lectern, and the hall are but a faint echo of this view. Between buildings and living beings, there is a porous membrane. We are greatly honored that it is Bernard Tschumi who gives the first lecture in memory of Marc. Tonight, lectern, Hall, and Marc will live once again.
Thank you, Paveen. It's with reluctance that I bridge. It's with reluctance that I bridge between your beautiful words and what we have this evening. So a very brief word to introduce Bernard. I think we're all familiar with his work. I think at this moment, it's also with tremendous gratitude to Paveen that we have the opportunity to have you here. And then also it's with deep regret that I start my directorship without him. I think we've all read Tschumi's work and familiar with also his architecture. What I want to do this evening is also to highlight a few wonderful conversations we had earlier with Carlos and Nigel, which really echo the legacy that has been here in the school. There is an extraordinary history here that also, I suppose, is redolent of the kinds of things that have gone on over the past few decades. And without further ado, I think the wonderful thing that you said is that you know the rhythm of the stairs up to my office. So the familiarity is here, and I'm sure it's mutual. So welcome. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Paveen. I think it's quite an honor to be back for this particular occasion. I don't even know somehow how to start. I know this auditorium from the early days when this part was not even opened. And when it opened, I remember one of the faculty members objecting to the fact that it was open. He said, talking here is talking like from the legs of trousers. And so it's an incredible sort of unusual occasion. And also possibly for some of the people in this room, I'll come back to that in a minute. But I'd like to say a few words about Marc, but not directly, but much more about what he represented. So my talk is going to be in two parts. One, relatively short, called Scholar versus Practitioner, and the other one, which will be the main body of it, will be Concept versus Context. Now, regarding, sorry, my voice for some reason is going, but I think I'll make it till the end. It's, of course, in homage for Marc Cousins, but not only for what he did, but also from what he represented. And also probably for having made such a place out of the AA, in the same way as a number of people made this building an incredible meeting place. And the reason why I bring this list of names, you'll recognize who most of them are, or every one of them, is that architectural thought is really also a conversation. I'm quoting here the word that Alvin Boyarsky liked so much, a conversation. And this conversation could only happen because people sort of encountered in this room or throughout this building in a way that is almost unprecedented and has not happened since. So just for that, I think it's an incredible pleasure to be here. And even just if I may, as I was starting to prepare this talk, as it happened, someone will recognize whose carpet it is. That's the place where I normally work. The carpet, of course, is Nigel Coates, who, together with a number of people in this room, have played a very important role in questioning what this is. In other words, is an architect a scholar or a practitioner? And the reason why I bring that is maybe a form of anxiety about the present and something that I would like to express in relationship to the extraordinary role that Mark Cousin played. Many architects in the last, let's say, half a century have been neither really scholars nor practitioners. They wrote, they could think, they could illustrate, they could represent. And somehow they were not quite what the AIA in America or the RIBA in England would consider as architect practitioners. They were not scholars either. They were a little bit the equivalent of people like this, who actually never got a PhD and never were recognized by the establishment education system of their surroundings. In other words, Derrida never got tenure, nor did Roland Barthes, nor did Foucault. So what is interesting is that it's a few places that acted at the center of conversation. Here, do you recognize, of course, the Architectural Association, the Bauhaus, or the Mies building in Chicago, or Rudolph, or even some in Latin America, Artigas, who were indeed questioning that differentiation between what is a scholar, what is a practitioner. And this is so important that it needs to be recalled at a time when School of Architecture are still a place where there is a freedom of thinking and of talking and of drawing, but at the same time something strange has begun to happen, which is the subdivision or the division between, on one hand, the PhDs, and on the other hand, the PUP. The PUP are Professor of Professional Practice. If you want to be hired as a practicing architect or as an architect in the United States, now you will be called not as a professor of architecture, like maybe Monet or Mies, you will be called a professor of professional practice. That distinction is somehow problematic in terms of what architecture is about, which is really an encounter which can happen here in this building in the members' room, or at Columbia on the staircases, or at least until the fire brigade forced us to put doors and prevented us from smoking. These days, I take my students during what is called the desk crit in the United States. I take them to Grand Central or to the High Line or to the public library in order indeed to develop somehow a counter move towards this division, which, by the way, if I show Columbia, it's fascinating. I love that building, but it's a strange building where the library is entirely separate from the studios, from the school itself. The school is suspended from above, the library is growing from below. And that differentiation or that opposition was actually part of very much the history of Columbia University School of Architecture, whereby William Ware was the scholar, Charles McKim of McKim, Mead and White was the builder. And they never talked to one another except in conflict. So this conflict, I think, is really important to avoid. And we need people to bridge that that gap, in a sense, that is artificially created, we need people like Mark Cousins that bring a totally different approach. By the way, there is some hope. I'll show you here just a recent quote from our current dean at Columbia, Andres Hake, proposing an opposition between, on one hand, exclusion and purity on one hand, and inclusion and messiness on the other hand. He representing, of course, inclusion and messiness. So I'll finish this part by reading you the last sentence that Mark Cousins spoke at the end of a lecture called, if I remember correctly, Architecture and Its Past. The study of the architectural past, as opposed to the study of architectural history, is able not simply to provide the student with an armature they neither want nor find an opportunity for using, an opportunity for using within their education, but for one which really enables the student to develop a specific kind of architectural intuition without which, in any case, their design will be nothing. The notion of architectural intuition is not, how could I say, a random issue. As one has defined the word architecture, intuition is somehow the equivalent to a shortcut of rationality. So let me go to the second part. Now, anything that has to do with architecture can take a number of different expressions, form, or intention. So I'd like to show you a project that, by the way, many of the projects that I'm going to show today are known either very well by people who have heard me before or through publications. But I'm trying to give a particular edge to them in relationship to this particular occasion today. So this we are talking about almost half a century ago, at a time when we used here at the AA in the unit, what it was called at the time, Unit 2, then Unit 10, we used to give students texts that were by famous authors like Edgar Allan Poe, Franz Kafka, or Hermann Hesse, and a few others. And the idea was that instead of starting with a program, with a brief, like one says here in England, with square meters or square feet, giving them a text that was already a piece of culture. In other words, just as, how could I say, a program or a brief is always equivalent to a chunk of culture. In other words, if I do the description of a house, I may say a bedroom, a living room, or a bathroom. That's a cultural decision. There were periods in history when those differentiations did not exist. So rather than starting with the program, the square meters, we thought, let's start with a narrative, let's start with a story. And for 2 or 3 years, they were these authors. And then we thought, well, maybe let's try something a little harder, because architecture sometimes is filled with distortions. And so we thought, well, how's about trying to have an author who has been questioning the idea of language And by taking Joyce Garden, by the way, comes from an era where one part of London was extremely under sort of pressure. It was Covent Garden, and the site of that little narrative, we gave it as Covent Garden, and therefore Joyce's Garden. Just to give you an example, the idea of the collapse of words, if I do an architectural equivalent, I would take a column like this, and I would make it a door at the same time, turning it into a dolmen. Now, what is a dolmen? What does it look like? How does it swing? That was the question that we asked ourselves. That idea of bringing a little bit of the dynamics of any architectural work was something that was fascinating me at the time. I had discovered those incredible, how do you call that, notations in this particular case of a very early filmmaker, Sergei Eisenstein, who somehow tried to express the simultaneous expression of movement, action, music, and of course the storyline. That seemed to be so fascinating for an architect who had learned simply to do plan sections, elevations, axonometric perspectives. Suddenly to try to express things that touch upon the five senses. So this questioning was literally asking really to place into this sort of, how could I say, hesitation about what is the form of expression of architectural thought. So the early work, my early work, really played along these lines, trying through later something that became more, how can I say, ambitious, called the Manhattan Transcripts, which took some urban archetypes, one could call them almost like a typology of different part of the city, in this case Manhattan, where the Parc, the murder or the violent act in that space was being expressed by a form of notation which was tripartite, which differentiated the action, the plan, and the movement. In other words, telling the story both architecturally, it is an architectural narrative, but it's also of what happens in it, in other words, a murder, and the movements that take place. In other words, saying that you cannot simply separate any of them from one another. There is no such thing as autonomy. And so in many ways, these drawings were very sequential. One of them is a 33 or 32 feet long drawing, 11 meters, which implied that the only way to look at it was to walk along it, because you could not possibly see it all at once. Hence, this, while the tripartite mode of notation was happening on each frame of the sequence, it was also in terms of the reading of it. And these experiments, taking again different urban typologies like the tower, indeed in this particular case, what is the most extreme thing that could happen is, of course, a fall against gravity, or a block and cutting into that urban block and trying to explore different mode of movement notation to a slightly surreal manner, like a football, American football movement notation, that would be a guideline to how that space would be organized. Soon, during that particular work, which lasted 2 or 3 or 4 years, the fact that it was simply on a sheet of paper became a limitation, and it became interesting to try to make them three-dimensional, to do a certain materialization. Here, I apologize for showing myself at the time, imitating the position of the actor in the film Scarface, 1932, in this construction, which was built literally by my own hand, and I think a graduate from the AA who was helping me to bang on those nails. And so for a while, these constructions were literally transposed into material expression. Yes, here, amusingly enough, again, two of them in New York City, this one in the Netherlands. No, sorry. This in the Netherlands in Middelburg, and here in this great exhibition room here on the ground floor. So, in other words, the point was that architecture was all about concept, thoughts, ideas, movement, but also it had to refer to a certain materialization. And hence, the result of this was to continue to try to explore this idea of space movement, event space, SEM, space event movements, in a variety of ways. Now, something very unusual happened, which is like winning the lottery the first time you buy a ticket. I entered a competition called the Parc de la Villette, in which there was a very large industrial slaughterhouse, and as it happened, started to test things that I've probably continued doing the rest until now, whereby whenever we start a project is to look at precedence, parks in this case of the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century, but also different possibilities. In other words, there is never one single solution. There are always several alternatives, several options, and so the starting point is always to very quickly, within half an hour of the beginning of anything, starting to see, like I would say, intuitively, what other possibilities they would be, and then testing them on the on the site, the territory that is given, and then selecting one of them for sometimes very objective reason, or simply sometimes, like in this particular case, the bottom right is the point grid of the Plan Voisin of Le Corbusier, which was at the time a project that was unanimously hated by architects, so I felt if they hate it so much, it has to be good. So started to test this particular point grid, and that became the project itself. And when I say that it's not only because of the point, it is actually a superimposition of 3 systems which correspond exactly to this space, event, and movement in a system of points, a system of lines, a system of surfaces that can be appropriated. So that became the project. I think you've seen it, or you may have visited it. I'll just bring these images simply to show how, in many ways, that dialogue between old and new, the 19th century Paris, 21st century point grid, and how people would simply, how could I say, appropriate it. And so that notion that a project could start literally out of the dynamics of movement, the movements of body in space, became interesting because that was a relatively uncharted territory. There were relatively few people working with this type of notation, a little bit in the art scene or in dance, and hence providing one with an incredible amount of freedom to develop things that could then be materialized, and through means that can be simply, molded or lit. So in such a way that it could become the generator of enjoyment or of pleasure of crowds. Amusingly enough, this is one of the so-called folie. By the way, the word folie was a word play on the meaning of the word in French. It means just as much madness as it means small house in a garden. It was also probably a way to suggest that things could happen. It was a so-called music stage, but something that often happens. You don't know what will happen with your buildings. And as the whole area of the northeast of Paris became gentrified because of the Parc, some of the new residents decided that the music was actually a bother and went to court and asked the music to be stopped. So I was invited to redesign, not to redesign, I was not going to touch the red part of it, but it became a ticket booth for a circus. So I found myself in an interesting situation of having to design what had been qualified as a historical monument, and as a result not allowed to touch it. So as you can see, the tent, this ticket booth, is exactly properly installed so that at no moment it touched. I thought I would want to show you as part of new work. But going back a little bit to that other era, showing you perhaps things that you do not necessarily know, but at least one person will here. I was fascinated with fireworks, and that's the image that became fairly well known because it was published and again as with the following caption, the ideal architecture is the idea of fireworks because it burns into oblivion. Now, this rather impressive black and white photograph I've never shown the actual photograph it's coming from. And here is the photograph. Actually, the firework is about a foot tall. It's at the floor, on the floor in front of a fence. And we just turned it for publication purposes upside down. And that became the beginning of an incredible exploration of notating fireworks and finding a way to express something which was absolutely sort of transient and showing it to firework manufacturers who couldn't understand a thing when we showed them, and they said, couldn't you describe it? And we did. We said, well, here it does boom and here it does bang, and then they were happy, and that's how it became the fireworks at La Villette. So in other words, somehow the invention is just as important as the concept, and in many ways I have to say that I think last time I came to the A was on a day, it was raining like today, but possibly much more, when the chairman at the time had proposed a reenactment of the fireworks. And as I was talking about it, one member of the audience, a very dear friend of mine, Colin Fournier, asked this question, but you know, you bring so much rationality in what you talk. Aren't they things that you do intuitively? And so when I saw the remark from my cousin about the necessity of intuition, I thought that's also what it is all about. So just to give further examples of program juxtaposition and notation, a competition done later on, a year or two later, for an opera house in Tokyo, where the mode of notation becomes immediately through a parallel with music notation, a way to articulate and to edit the different part of the building in order to turn it into an architectural plan. So this goes also with that materialization. In other words, every part of the different linear bands, in this case, is actually a different material, so that the concept itself is really derived from an initial idea. And here I'll show you something that I've started to use at regular interval. You may have seen it before, of trying to look into architecture, into what is an architectural concept. Of course, a pyramid is, there is no such thing in nature. It's a complete human invention. Same thing with the labyrinth. There are no labyrinth in the world unless you invent it. I always loved poets and writers inventing stories, like the famous Little Prince story of the Little Prince, saying, "What do you think it is?" He asked the airplane pilot, and the pilot says, "It's a hat," and the kid says, "No, no way, it's an elephant that has been swallowed by a snake." So in many ways, architecture becomes a definition of concepts. Here, I again bring it in relationship to the idea of materialization, namely that whether you build it or not, it always refers to something that is built, that could be built, or that will be built. In many ways, in other disciplines, in other areas of knowledge, you have also things that are invented from scratch. Cinema would not exist without the invention of montage. Here, Eisenstein again. Psychoanalysis would not exist without the invention of the unconscious. Freud's living room. Le Corbusier inventing the plan libre, the free plan. That's an architectural concept. Or Friedrich Kiesler inventing the idea of the endless space. So in other words, architecture is the art of building concept. Architecture is the art of building concepts through spaces and materials. Look at this one by Louis Kahn of spaces that are served or serving. Here I bring the superimposition of point line surfaces, or bigness by Koolhaas, or in a more, in a sense, philosophical manner, differentiating the abstraction of a concept, the appearance of a percept, and the emotions, the emotion of an affect. So these tend to play with one another, they overlap. They are all part of one's understanding of what architecture is. And sometimes sometimes it simply doesn't quite merge in that smooth way. It becomes something which is truly an intuitive invention. The famous Casa Malaparte by the writer, with a little bit of help of an architect libero. But this is important. In other words, it's reinventing a different type of context. Now, context is unavoidable, whether it is visual, whether it was physical, whether it is social, whether it is economic, etc., etc. So inevitably, you engage, whether you deny it or not, you engage in a sort of dialogue and of reinterpretation. And that interpretation of the program, for example, allows quite extraordinary games of, how could I say, of I don't want to use the word manipulation. I'd rather use the word permutation or transformation. In other words, the different part of a program can be played upon in a way that immediately affect the architecture itself. This magazine illustration is a good way to express that double entendre. Or when we, in an early competition, proposed that for a major library in Paris, one would combine or superimpose or collide a running track and a library, so that the athlete of the 21st century would be a scholar, or the scholar of the 21st century would be simultaneously an athlete. These collisions, which are sometimes almost surrealistic, for example, the one of old and new, which happens all the time to us in our historical cities, become interesting when you realize that you can find a space of invention. That particular building in the north of France, in Tourcoing, was destined to be demolished. I went to visit it. I saw those extraordinary roofs in very bad condition. And interior spaces which were so amazing, they were about 4 times taller than what the budget allowed for that particular program, which was a school for artists doing mixed media, let's say film and dance, or sculpture and video. So bringing the two together was a way to suggest that you could simply keep the old and just giving it a second life by putting a particular, like a second roof that would make it possible to keep the existing building so that the snow would not collapse its roofs, and adding in that in-between space these movement vectors, that fascination for movement that in this particular case becomes a stage for the artist to do a series of events or of performances, so that the act of proposing a particular yes, I'll call it concept, had an effect also on that part of town as it appeared, as it was hovering over the old buildings in the neighborhood while maintaining them. And that was, by the way, at a time when in architecture the great debate was about so-called historical postmodernism that was to conserve existing building versus neo-modernism, which was about using images from the early 20th century. At the time, I think we felt that that was a wrong debate. It didn't matter. It was all about trying to establish something different. So it was not about form. It was about strategy. And I have always a little bit of anxiety about people who think that form is the driver. In reality, it is always about how you, in a way, conspire in developing an idea. So, in other words, architecture is not simply what it looks like, it's also what it does. And you can play these games, because they're games as well, but they are very serious games. They are really about society as a whole. Reversing expectation, for example, for an exhibition hall or small gallery in northern Netherlands, we were asked to do for a festival of music and video, we were supposed to do a dark space where the public could look at those films, and we propose, on the contrary, to make it entirely transparent so that it would become a public space for that particular summer. The town liked it so much that it's still there nearly 30 years later, as people not only at the time used it as a strange place of experimentation, since we discovered, actually we didn't fully expect it, that the video screens were reflecting, yes, I forgot to say something really important. The structure itself is entirely made of glass. The beams and the columns, or the shear walls, are made of glass. So the reflection of these screens made it extremely difficult to find your balance, as we, of course, had made the space slightly tipped to the side, making it difficult to distinguish what was real and what was a reflection. Then, for the following 25, 30 years, artists used it for installations at regular, each season, reinventing what had become a generator. And so this notion of asking questions, but action that a question that can become action in themselves. Just another example of this, all buildings, when they get a certain size, have to deal with a word that I don't like, still don't like it, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Have to deal with envelopes, you know, how you keep the rain out, how you keep the burglar out. So quite often, today we use double or triple envelopes, but if you take them apart from one another, you can have an envelope that keeps the rains out, made of steel, and an envelope that acts as a support for the event, here made of concrete. And so the development of the concept or the idea becomes the architecture itself. In other words, the most important part is that in-between space, the one that's slightly unpredictable, as it's not part of the organized spectacle and not part of what it looks like from the outside. And then as you develop it, you realize that you can also push that materialization even to the next step and make the seats entirely transparent. So it is the people themselves who become the heroes of the circumstances. But as soon as you make that materialization of the different envelopes, you realize you can do it from one context to another. You can make it different. And if your first project was in a sort of rather desolate urban sort of highway junction, the next one, because people liked your building, was actually in a forest, beautiful 200-year-old trees forest. So we said, yeah, let's try to play with light. Let's try to play with material. There were a lot of wood factories around. And so started to say, how's about using wood for the main structure, using transparent polycarbonate for the outer envelope. In other words, taking something which was entirely abstract and turning it into an architectural statement. So hence you take it, you push it as far as you can. Even the seats are not anymore transparent plastic. They are now made of wood. They're part of the interior. And what is fascinating is that the two plans are almost identical. Conceptually, they are the same. But as you realize that the perception and the effect that you derive from the building itself is entirely different. There is no correspondence simply because of that very slight touch. And that fascinated me, that realizing that architecture was, as one says, not about the condition of design, but the design of conditions. So this is a general description, a general analysis. At no moment until then, the circumstances became such that they could not be any concept without being directly aware of the context in which it was. And that really fascinated me, that when we entered that particular competition, the so-called New Acropolis Museum, we were confronted with a challenge which is easy to understand, probably the most influential building in the history of Western architecture. The site itself, with an incredibly rich archaeological find that we were not supposed to touch. And then, of course, not very far from here, the Elgin marble, as it's still called at the British Museum, the famous Parthenon frieze. And the challenge was to try to bring it all together. Now, that particular context was such that there was no way to alter it. In other words, you could not negate it. You could only choose a concept that would somehow bring it together. So those three parts, the Parthenon or the Acropolis, the museum itself, and the archaeological finds, were a complete sort of wild bet that we did at the time of the competition. Here I want to pay a very short but a very warm-felt homage to Dimitrios Pandermalis, who was the director of the museum at the time, had worked 10 years to be able to organize that competition, that during the nearly 10 years it took to build it, and the following 10 years was incredibly supportive in this manner of trying to establish a different type of dialogue between contemporary expression and historical presence from 2,500 years ago. Dimitrios Pandermalis died a few weeks ago. So, again, superimposition of different parts. Sometimes, like most of the sketches that I'm showing you, are done in transportation. In other words, they are done in a plane or in a train. In New York, in the subway, this was done in the back of a taxi. They are simply ways to take shortcuts in thinking. You don't need to be a great draftsman, you just are simply transposing what's in your head through your hand, and the hand is a fantastic vehicle to do so. And that becomes eventually the building itself. It becomes something that transforms the surroundings of that part of the city, establishes a dialogue between old and new, establishes a dialogue with the archaeological remnants. I was very proud of inventing what I call the tripartite column, as it sits over the walls that were from that long distant past, making it fascinating for kids and visitors. Movement was a major issue. In other words, how museums are fascinating because they quite often simultaneously about a narrative, the narrative of the curators or of history, and then an architectural narrative. And then when it's translated into space, you can develop certain spaces that bring the most spectacular aspect, but the spectacle is really for the work itself. In this particular case, the polished marbles of antiquity being opposed to the rough nature of the concrete. The concrete is intentionally meant to be rough in order not to compete with the perfection of the marble. And then the idea is being taken to the extreme so that even the concrete becomes a sort of acoustical absorbing envelope for the work itself. And fascinating is that you encounter certain parts that came from many years earlier, the famous frieze, which when I showed you that Eisenstein notation of the early 30s, it was actually from a film called Alexander Nevsky. And when I saw for the first time the frieze, I realized it looked amazingly like the Alexander Nevsky notation. That's the very same frieze, the very same notation that had inspired me or influenced me rather when I did that early drawing of notation. Here I can't resist showing you on the right-hand side of the image the frieze of the ancient Greek sculptor Phidias and his friends, and the actual movie sequence that actually exactly echoes the frieze from an earlier period. As we were talking upstairs in the chair's office about fragments and about explosions, I thought of this particular part of the main room of that sequence is the two frontispiece, where here an explosion had transformed each of these extraordinary sculptures into surrealistic movement. So introducing something which suggested that sometimes by the redefinition you actually get back to a how could I say, in a sense, not unconsciously, but not exactly willingly, you arrive at, again, something that I feel so uncomfortable with, the idea of form. A museum in the center of France, in Burgundy, where a battle had taken place. And there were no very many reasons to start one way or another. I found fascinating a certain number of patterns that exist either in nature or simply through man's invention. And then thought, let's be relaxed about it, and why not trying to express that particular battle in two circular building. Now that was important. It was one battle, but we said there are two armies. So there will be two buildings. One building for the Romans, the other one for that was not yet French, it was the Gauls. And one of them was where the army of the Romans, Julius Caesar, was, and made of exactly the same material as the one of his soldiers. The other one was made of stones. Why? Because on the hill where the Gauls had retreated, that was the location that I chose to locate. We were allowed to choose the location of the buildings. And so carving, well, before that, taking these two very abstract configuration in order to establish one that was the camp of the Romans, using a configuration which in a sense was using the same material but in a very different manner, and developing into a building which was also playing that investigation of envelope. Here in this particular case, the meeting of the outer envelope made of wood and the inner envelope made of glass, filtering the light in the process. Movement vectors were, of course, there in order to welcome the tourists and the visitors, but also to establish a movement and a space that is used for different events. So somehow the redefinition of what had been a rather predictable museum's conversation became an opportunity to explore a little further how you build things. The first building has been completed. The second one is perhaps going to be built someday. I take a sort of consolation by we have a prototype somewhere on the hill there, which has been there for about 7 years. That's sort of, it'll become a postcard someday, I suppose. So, but the play with this question of form became indeed raising question. And when we won the possibility of developing a new zoo out of the existing Paris Zoo, I was fascinated by the fact that, first of all, zoos are really problematic for 100 of reasons, but one is that you never know who is inside, who is outside. You know, of course, the aviary by Cedric Price. Here, it's unclear. And then I thought maybe that lack of clarity should be explored further. So the material that was used, that is used for birds and a number of animals, could become the envelope for people. Here is the entrance to the zoo, and then for different type of building, whether they were a restaurant or a house for rhinos or for other exotic creatures, became a way to take again the very same material, the wood that was brought, that was used for that museum, this time in a disorderly manner. In other words, introducing a different type of relation. And of course, questioning the idea of how to use those different materials themselves in an architectural discourse. So, in other words, it's really about trying to transpose a thought process in a way which is, dare I say, respectful of what you're trying to do. I've always been fascinated by that famous statement that Salisbury Cathedral is different from a bicycle shed. One is architecture, the other one is a building. I always thought that it was rather the other way around, that a bicycle shed with a concept was architecture, a cathedral without one was mere building. Anyway, I wanted to show you my friend, the giraffe, who was there during the whole of construction because they could not be moved out of the site. So you become aware of things which are then, strangely enough, not necessarily fully abstract. Another example of conceptualizing a context or contextualizing a concept. An extraordinary industrial area in China, an hour from Beijing, has to be torn down for the development of a new city, where a museum is there to celebrate the museum, celebrate the industrial leftovers, at least in its memory. I showed the drawings at length at the Bartlett a few years ago. Peter Cook probably remembers it. But now, finally, it is built. And it is interesting to see that somehow how things which are at first fairly sort of strategic intuition and starting to turn it into materials at a scale which is unheard of. You'll see it in a second. Here is the building. That's not a rendering. The Guggenheim Museum would fit several times into these very large cones. Here is a major sort of space research rocket, the ramp, and a different. So, in other words, the development of the architecture is directly a sort of dialogue with another period of history. When I started to do that, I realized that there was a moment when one needs to question certain things one has hated all one's life. And while I always liked cortili, courtyards, interior spaces, I felt very uneasy with the idea of facade. And every one of the projects that I've shown you so far were actually projects that found a way to bypass the confrontation with what is a facade. So at the occasion of a commission, not a competition, a commission 10 years ago of designing a cultural center for a small town in on the Adriatic coast of Italy, I thought, well, let's test it. If I feel comfortable dealing with things in China or in ancient Greece, what about trying to ask oneself what is a facciata, what is a facade, and what is a cortile, what is a courtyard? So first of all, testing as often as always different mode of approaching a project. In other words, nothing is taken for granted. You test different possibilities, different options. And so in this case, yes, a court, a square organization, a triad at first, and then slowly arriving to that idea that maybe the building is nothing but a cortile and a fasciata. So when I talk about all these different variations, the fascinating thing is that when you work in an architectural office with people that you like debating certain issues with, you end up with a number of different possibilities. It furthers the discussion. It becomes actually a sort of investigation and exploration, and that's why probably architects tend to work so much, because it's exciting, even if you do not know sorry, again my voice, you do not know necessarily when you start a project where you are going. And so eventually you arrive at that opposition between the courtyard on the left, the facade on the right, and you'll be amused if you see that Italian church. There was always a double envelope, right? You have the brick support structure, and then you have a cladding envelope on the outside made of more sort of luxurious one, like marbles or so. And the same thing applies with the interior. So this differentiation between the inner and the outer envelope was actually quite fascinating. And we tested a number of different ways to do it, trying to negate every of the standard, let's say, approaches, rediscovering others. The four facades of the building are all different. I'm not sure if I like this particular drawing, but the point was that it was really about testing different things, architecture as an investigation. I'll show you now two last projects that are not known. The next to this concert hall that was done 10 years ago, we have been asked to design a second building, which would be this time for laboratories and classrooms and education in general. And so next to this particular dome, I thought that I would simply take it to the next step, and this time bringing something different, where instead of a solid, which is the concert hall, trying to bring something in opposition, in a sense, saying that right next to it, I would do, instead of a solid inside the dome, to put a void within it. And here is the two buildings. The building has just started construction, literally this early October. You're the very first people to see it. Here is some of the exploration. Again, it starts with those rough drawings done on one's knee in some taxi or so, and then developing the various configurations that go with the logic of the required program, so that it becomes a different kind of space that accommodates the idea of movement, that accommodates the idea of different way to use the building itself. Let's invite me in 4 years, and I'll show you more. Just completed, literally, if I lost my voice, is that yesterday I was taking a group to visit a very large building in Paris for the Paris University, Paris-Saclay. Very large, it's over a kilometer walk to go from one side to the other. It was a major competition where, not to mention name, Herzog de Meuron and MBRDV were working each, and myself, with some of the largest construction companies, and developed here again something that plays with that notion of the movement vectors that would meet in the center in a very large galleria. So the building is more of an urban statement. As I said, it's over 100,000 square meters, which raises other issues which we won't have time to discuss today. But in a way, again, the articulation of thought is based on a particular idea, and then the architectural expression, the selection of material, is in a way an attempt always to reinforce what has been thought about. And so that somehow there is a direct relationship with the abstract intelligence in a way that architecture always implies, and the way to transform the building, transform the thought into a built work. And so construction, and then the building as it's now, not yet professionally photographed, but soon. So here it is. So I tried to go a little, longer than I expected. As one said, if I had more time to prepare the talk, I would have been shorter. But in a sense, it's a pleasure to discuss issues which we are all confronted with when we develop a built work. It's always about thoughts and ideas and materials. Thank you very much. Yes, any question are welcome. This is.
Bernard, I felt that in the beginning, your short first part, that you were really articulating a certain cri de coeur about the atmosphere of creativity in teaching, and the atmosphere of that being this sort of hybrid creature that is neither theorist nor just a picture person or a building person. And then I felt I was sort of holding that and listening to the main part of the lecture, and as you well know, I've been for many, many years an admirer of the clarity of your conceptual ideas, your diagrams, your systems, and it shines through. I have a suspicion, in fact, I almost know that you can come upon these concepts quite quickly. I don't mean superficially, but you have a mind that can see an organization and a clarity. And then it seems to me that in this effort to bypass the whole hang-ups of taste, style, fashionable systems, that what you're doing is doing a sort of selective mannerism. I use the word mannerism deliberately because it's a sort of uncomfortable word. I think we do a lot of what we do in a mannered way, meaning that we have preferences, but we avoid the obvious, or try to avoid the traps of fashion. But nonetheless, our procedure has certain manners to it, and our selectivity of materials, for instance, which is something that when one comes to build, gets more and more, the nature of stuff. And then you bring in this rather interesting issue of the, as it were, the appropriateness of stuff in a particular situation, which is both cultural and to do with the nature of the place. To what extent, my question, I suppose, because it is a question, is to what extent is there a certain parallel between the frustration and sadness that I feel in the little first part of the lecture, and possibly the fact that the sorts of conversations that are about the stuff do not appeal in academia. They're very difficult to have with students, and they immediately want to see what is your taste, what is your dogma. Can you comment on that?
Oh, the question coming from you is particularly illuminating because, sorry now to turn it into a private conversation between you and I, is that to have been such a brilliant educator on your part for so many years has proved one point, is that why is it exciting to be in a school is that what you do is done in such a way because you do not know what is coming out of it. In other words, there are schools of architecture where the teacher knows ahead of time what it's going to be the result that is being asked from a particular group of students. I think there are people who are educators, who are teachers, who are actually part of the conversation, who, on the contrary, want to be the stimulator of something they haven't seen before. And I would say, Peter, you have been one of these, and thank you for that. Now, well, that's a different question. I will simply say one thing about the beginning of your question when you said that you thought that it was probable that a concept come quickly when I work. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes it's just like that. I go and visit that abandoned building in the north of France. I walk there and I say, wow, that's what it should be. But there are times when actually it's not coming. And you do variation, and you have your people doing variation and further, and you have a dozen of those half-baked, and none of them are okay. And then you know it's time to submit, and you submit that halfway cooked, baked building, and you think, my God, if we win, that would be terrible, right? So you realize that it takes you're not too worried because it takes a long time to go from schematic design to design development. There's some hope, but indeed it doesn't always come immediately. But you're searching for it. And then to stay with that particular example, when we did the large roof over the old buildings, that was an immediate sort of intuition. But we submitted it, we won, but I was not terribly happy with it. I thought that's not quite enough. And that it's only during schematic design that the idea of the movement vectors came about, and then that was good, right? So, in other words, sometimes the process itself is there to surprise yourself. And I think this is what it's exciting about this type of work. That's probably why people who like what they're doing never retire. They keep going, Niemeyer 103 still going on, right? So anyway, enough. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, hi. Okay. Thank you, firstly, for your presentation. I was just curious, obviously, we associate a lot of your work with being subversive, of course, Parc de Villette in the 70s, and as you were saying, the conspiratorial thought behind your work. I just wondered, in terms of the ticket booth scenario that you said local residents rejected the kind of music scenario, did you ever consider to conspire in that moment and resist, actually, and reject that initial change in time?
Oh, sure, many times. But they went to court, and the court said they were right, you know. So there are times when, indeed, the world around you is such that things happen.
Hi. I got a lot of inspirations from the sentence of architecture is a materialization of concept. And recently I'm doing some research about engagement. So I was curious about if the architecture is only about the materialization of individual concept, or it can also be public concept or the concept of some collective things. Are there any possible structure for us to make public to engage with the design process?
Of course, there is, excuse me, the history of architecture, it's filled with discussion whether it's the utopian socialist at the end of the 18th century or in the early 1912, 1917, when particular socialist ideals tried to use architecture as a way to transform society. And that has been a debate ever since. The question is always that architecture per se is at a scale which is in a sense minute in relationship to the forces that drive a society. In other words, the economy or different social movement. So it's relatively, it's simultaneously incredibly tempting to bring them together, and they, as the two examples I gave you, utopian socialist and revolutionary of the 1917 Russian Revolution, they are incredibly liberating. At the same time, there are certain moments when the constraint of fabrication becomes such that you don't separate them, but they don't happen at the same time. And yet, I think what you used, the first word you used was the word engagement. I think the engagement is very important. That's the general, now I will use the word knowingly, that's the context in which you operate. It's not necessarily its concept. Thank you for the question.
Hello, hi. I was interested when you mentioned in the United States that there is this difference between PhD and practicing professors, right? I think in UK there is a similar division between whether you go towards architecture and practicing or into the academia. Do you see a future? What's your view on kind of merging those two, let's say, disciplines, even though it's one? How do you think it should go towards the future?
Well, I know where it should not go. I think that architecture is simultaneously, as one says in Italian or in Latin, cosa mentale, a thing of the mind, and also something which is made of materials. And so that ability to juggle the two has been fantastic for 4,000 years, more. I don't want to split it into, on one hand, the scholars, and on the other hand, the professors of professional practice. For me, it's one single art. And that's what's so incredible about architecture. Sorry to be serious.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It's such an inspiring one. And then I have a question about when you are mentioning context, you said we choose the concept. But however, when I was doing the researches about the context, I usually, it's quite dynamic to me because my understanding of the context is changing all the time till like the last minute of the project, although it's like an unfinished project anyway. But it's like the context is dynamic, it's changing, and our concept is changing while our understanding of the context is changing. So the question is, how do you balance the dynamic between the context and the concepts while you are making the design?
Your question is welcome because it suggests that both concept and context are actually not finite words. They are actually floating and they can get different definition. That's certainly the case of context, as I mentioned it. It can be a political context, it can be a social, an economic, or even a pure, physical context. I always laugh when I think of a school of architecture that we design near the city of Paris, where it rains all the time, and then try to use the same concept in Miami, Florida, where it rarely rains, and then started to use different ways to give an interpretation of the concept. But at first, the concept is identical. In other words, as you move geographically, what was inside becomes outside, what was an inner court becomes an outer court, what was being glass becomes ceramics. So in other words, there's a moment when what you describe as a context, its transposition in a different context means that the concept actually has changed as well. So that's quite exciting in a sense that you are quite aware of what you're doing. But that applies, I'm interested in architectural history because I will see how a bath is being transformed into a market, or a market into a bath, or a bath into a religious building. So in other words, there are ways where certain quote-quote typologies tend to become the host of a number of different circumstances. And depending on that particular, again, quote-quote typology, generates a different way to be translated by the society of its time. And that you find out certainly in the last 2,000 years.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I think of that, think of this particular building and what it has generated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernard. Just one very important thing before we head off for drinks. This is also the launch of the compendium of Marc's lectures, which have arrived today. And this is a wonderful moment. It contains two very important things, which in fact you reference both Joyce and the Casa Malaparte in form of Godard's Le Mépris. So please do. It's available at the back, and I think it's a wonderful way of remembering Marc. And also thank you, Praveen, for making both that possible, and Bernard. So thank you again. Thank you, Praveen.